Welcome everybody to this Zoom Cafe Scientifique presentation meeting. It's a shame we can't do it sort of live. Well, we could do it, but we didn't think we'd get so many people. Our usual venue in the new Headingley club. Have a glass of what we particularly fancy. Before we get on to the main event, I'll just say we are obviously watching the COVID situation, as probably everybody is. It'd be nice to get back to live. We're not sure about the next one yet, whether that will be a Zoom one or a live one, but we can let you know. If you're not already on our email list, then do sign up from the Headingley Cafe Scientifique website, and we can keep you informed that way. And we have got a full program even going into the next 2022. Just to say, the next one is somebody from the physics department of Leeds University, Catherine Walsh, who's giving a talk about habitable worlds, looking for them and what it takes to have one. So that's the sort of astronomical come biological flavour to that one. As I say, so that will be on the 13th of December. And we have several going into the New Year's, as I say, so you can find those all on the website. Well, now without further ado, I'll carry on introducing our tonight's speaker on a very topical subject of pandemics, and it's a great pleasure to have Colin Garner here with us to tell us about it. This is particularly about bacterial pandemics rather than a current viral one, but we have to watch out. We have to watch out and hopefully take precautions against such things as pandemics. So over to you, Colin, if that's all right. Yep.
Thanks very much, Paul, and good evening, everyone. I always feel these things are a bit of a sort of out-of-body experience because I'm not really sure who I'm talking to and I can't really see anyone's reactions. And I really regret not meeting everyone face to face, certainly over a pint, but maybe another time. So just by way of background, I'm Professor Colin Garner. I'm Chief Executive of a charity called Antibiotic Research UK. My own academic background was in pharmacology and toxicology, and more years than I could care to mention, I actually was a researcher at the University of Leeds for about 3 or 4 years. My lab was on Woodhouse Lane, believe it or not, in an old house. That was before the university had very fancy buildings. And it was a fun time, and I got to know quite a lot of people, including, I hope, some of those who are listening this evening. So background: pharmacology, toxicology, a lot of research, maybe mainly in the cancer field. But what I want to talk about tonight is antibiotic resistance, bacterial antibiotic resistance, and why I believe we have a particular challenge with that coming up. And you mentioned the term pandemic. It's probably one of the most used words in the current English language, pandemic. Maybe vaccines is another one. So, I mean, if I was going to give this talk probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I talked about infectious diseases and pandemics, everybody would look at me blankly and wonder what the hell I was talking about. Well, I don't think I need to tell people now what a pandemic looks like, and rather sadly. But what I'll talk about is potential for a bacterial pandemic and whether we are sleepwalking into the world's next one. And I think we'd all agree that we were very unprepared and ill-prepared for the COVID pandemic. And I don't actually see a great deal of difference between where we are with bacterial resistance and where we might have been with COVID 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that's what I want to highlight this evening. And I want to give you some background to the problem. So my talk will cover what is antibiotic resistance, or it's often referred to as AMR, antimicrobial resistance, but the man on the Clapham omnibus probably doesn't know the term AMR, but it's used quite a lot in the field. I'll talk about why it's important and talk a little bit about how antibiotics work and resistance mechanisms, and importantly, how we can prevent resistance, because we can all do something to help antibiotic resistance and prevention thereof. And then talk about the charity that I'm chief executive of and I founded several years ago now. And it also then ending up by, you know, how can you help? How can you help tackle this problem? And it's actually not all about money, unsurprisingly. So you go back nearly sort of 50, 60 years, and Sir Alexander Fleming, who was, of course, the discoverer of penicillin by accident, he said in his 1945 Nobel Prize winning lecture that it's not difficult to make microbes resistant to penicillin in the laboratory. And you can do so by exposing them to concentrations not sufficient to kill them. And the same thing has occasionally happened in the body. And by exposing microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. So Fleming already in 1945 was telling us about antibiotic resistance. And I read somewhere that actually somebody was warning us about this in 1938. So it ain't a new problem, folks. It's a very old problem. There's also a picture here of Nurse Sarah Whitlow, who we had the pleasure to meet, who's actually Alexander Fleming's granddaughter, and she's a nurse somewhere out in East Anglia, and a very unassuming lady, but a very nice lady, and she's an ambassador to our charity. So how does antibiotic resistance arise? Well, for those of you who don't know much about bacteria, bacterial cell division and the like, bacteria have been around on this planet for about 3 billion years. So they are sure survivors, and they have been able to survive anything and everything that's thrown at them, including antibiotics. So how is that? Why is that? Well, it's because they have quite a high rate of mutation. Typically, one mutation in about 100 million bacteria is quite common. They divide about every 20 minutes or so. So you can see that if you have a mutation, it can quite quickly amplify. So in the presence of an antibiotic, the bacteria, some of them will resist the antibiotic, and they are a mutant. I mean, they are resistant, they're antibiotic resistant. And what that means is that those bacteria, the mutated bacteria, can quite happily grow in the presence of the antibiotic. And that's what we mean when we talk about an antibiotic resistant infection. It's an infection that antibiotics won't treat. And as I'll talk about later, antibiotic resistance is on the rise pretty much around the globe, including in the United Kingdom. So when we think about bacteria, they are quite simple organisms, but they're actually quite complicated organisms because they've become very adaptable to protecting themselves. They can protect themselves against ionizing radiation, ultraviolet light, chemical toxins, and all sorts of other hazardous materials which would normally kill the bacteria, but they develop resistance mechanisms. So this is a shot of bacteria. This is a so-called gram-negative bacterium because it's got a cell wall. Now, the cell wall is actually protective of the bacterium against something that is going to try and penetrate through the cell wall. And these bacteria which have a cell wall are called gram-negative bacteria. That means they don't take up the gram stain. So these are the bacteria that are actually quite hard to kill. But these are just some of the antibiotics. I'm not going to run through these, but you can recognize some of them: cephalosporins, penicillins. They attack the biosynthesis of the cell wall. Some antibiotics will attack ribosomes, which are the sites of protein synthesis, where the machinery within the bacteria that makes proteins. There's also things that will attack the cytoplasmic membrane, as it's called, polymyxins and so on. So there are a number of targets which can be attacked within the bacteria. And of course, an ideal antibiotic is one that will kill the bacteria, preferably antibiotic resistant bacteria only, but they won't kill mammalian cells, so they won't be toxic to the person, only to the bacteria. But in case I forget, just to say that everybody thinks about antibiotics and antibiotic resistance as if antibiotics, the only harmful effect is antibiotic resistance, but actually that is not the only harmful effect. We're beginning to understand the composition of bacteria in the gut, the so-called microbiome. And we know that the microbiome integrity is very important, particularly during development of children. So if you wipe out the gut bacteria in children at an early age, you can actually have an impact on their health for the rest of their lives. Children who have antibiotics are more likely to get diabetes in older age. They are more likely to be obese, and they also may have some brain issues, some mental issues. There's been discussion about links between antibiotic administration and autism. So don't think that antibiotic harm is only antibiotic resistance. By wiping out the microbiome, all the bugs in the gut, you actually perturb the body's system, and that can have profound effects. And in fact, dare I say this, people talk about fecal transplants. They actually transplant good bacteria back into the gut after someone has been given antibiotics. And that's becoming a more common treatment for antibiotics after they've wiped out the gut bacteria. Now, in terms of resistance mechanisms, there are a variety of these. And again, I'll just run through these in a bit more detail. So one resistance mechanism is that the antibiotic penetrates into the bacteria, and then there's a mechanism that pumps the antibiotic out again. So you never get a concentration of the antibiotic in the bacteria that kill it, because they've got this very efficient method of pumping the antibiotic out. So those are so-called efflux pumps. They're also inactivating enzymes. So in particular, the penicillin type antibiotics, that so-called beta-lactam antibiotics, there's an enzyme called beta-lactamase, which is normally present in bacteria, and that is very good at killing, wiping out the penicillin antibiotic. So inactivating enzymes, another mechanism. I won't go into all these others, but the bacteria have a variety of mechanisms that mean that the antibiotics won't kill them if they have one of these mutations within them. And interestingly, although you think antibiotic resistance might be something that only has happened since antibiotics were developed, which is what, over the last 50 or more years, antibiotic resistant bacteria have actually been found in Egyptian mummies from 10,000 years ago. So, and that was long before antibiotics were developed. So the bacteria basically have mechanisms to prevent themselves being killed by toxins, and that is, an antibiotic is just a toxin as far as the bacteria is concerned. And of course, when you think about bacteria, many of them are present in the soil, and so for them to survive against, let's say, fungal toxins, which might be also produced in the soil, they will make themselves resistant so that they will survive in the soil. So lots of different resistance mechanisms. And actually, it's been very difficult scientifically to try and overcome these resistance mechanisms. In fact, I'm only aware of a resistance mechanism of the inactivation of being overcome. I don't think any of these other mechanisms as yet have we been able to overcome with drugs or any other means. Just to say that drug resistance, antibiotic resistance, arises primarily through the use of antibiotics. So this chart shows that where there is good antibiotic stewardship, as it's called, that is, people don't get antibiotics unless they're absolutely necessary. You can see that Sweden, Canada, Norway, Finland are all pretty low on this chart because they have good stewardship programs. Our stewardship program in the United Kingdom is improving, but nevertheless, we're like in the middle of this chart. So we're certainly not at the Swedish end, but we're not in the end, which is in Thailand or India, where antibiotic resistance is rife. So there is a spectrum of resistance within a population. And I'll talk in a moment about how resistance travels around the world, just in the same way that COVID traveled around the world. So resistance is here today. It's been estimated that about 700,000 people a year die from an antibiotic resistant infection. In Europe, the number is about 25,000, and in the UK, it may be as high as 12,000. So quite a common now occurrence, sadly, death due to antibiotic resistance. Surprisingly, death from an antibiotic resistant infection is not actually recorded on a death certificate. So if someone dies from pneumonia, that's what's on the death certificate, pneumonia, but you don't know if it was viral or bacterial, and you don't know if it was antibiotic resistant or not. So we're not very good at recording what the true scale of the problem is. And then, unless we know the true scale of the problem, then we don't know if we can tackle it properly with different sort of stewardship programs, for example. The problem has reached the media. I mean, everyone talks about superbugs. I always think that's a bit of a misnomer because there's nothing super about superbug. It's something that actually can harm you and it often kill you. So people know about infections in care homes or in hospital wards where people will be killed because of an antibiotic resistant infection. And these are just some of the headlines from various papers from around the country. In terms of transporting antibiotic resistant bacteria around the world, this was quite an interesting study. It's a bit of a complicated slide, but I'll walk you through it. So what these investigators did, they went to planes that were flying into Copenhagen Airport in Denmark, and they sampled the septic tanks from the toilets in these planes. And then they did what's called multiplex PCR to see how many antibiotic resistant bacteria were present in the toilets from those planes. And they plotted then the frequency of resistant organisms in the septic tanks. And you can see that planes that flew in from Greenland, let's say to Denmark into Copenhagen, were relatively low in resistant organisms in the toilets, whereas planes that flew in from countries like Pakistan and Thailand and Singapore, they had very high rates of resistant bugs in the toilets, indicating that people coming from those countries were probably carrying resistant bugs, and these would then be expelled in their feces in the toilet. But also, it's been shown that if you are a holiday traveler, for example, going to India, you have about a 30% chance of picking up an antibiotic resistant bug in your gut and bringing it back to the UK. So you can see with travel that these things can very quickly circulate around the planet. And so some of the resistance genes that are known, such as NDM1, as it's called, New Delhi metalloproteinase 1, that came from Delhi in India. Colistin resistance came from China. So these resistance genes are being transported around the world and reaching countries through travel mainly. We also, of course, can make our own resistance genes. We don't have to import them. And the overuse of antibiotics is one reason that can happen. So you can see that countries which are like the United States, for example, or Newark, planes coming in from those areas, they had much lower levels of resistant organisms in their toilets. When you think about antibiotic resistance, people tend to focus on human health aspects, but in fact, think about it. So antibiotics are being used in hospitals, being used in the community, prescribed by general practitioners. So the antibiotics then are excreted in the urine and feces and get into the sewage works. So that's one good way of spreading antibiotics and antibiotic resistant bugs around. But we also, sadly, in my view, use antibiotics for farming, not so much for treatment of infected animals, but quite often in some countries as growth promoters. And I think that's a completely balmy use of antibiotics. I've even heard of orange trees and orange groves being sprayed with antibiotics in California because there was an organism that made the crop bad. And so they decided they would spray the crop with antibiotics. Balmy. And again, in aquaculture, farming fish and sea and shellfish and the like, there's quite often antibiotics used there. So all those antibiotics being used, they end up in the environment, in the lakes, the rivers, the soils. And then also we have the manufacturers of these antibiotics who's then pump out through their waste antibiotics again into the environment. And in fact, in some parts of the world, there was a study done in Sweden. It was found that the concentration of one particular antibiotic, which is was a fluoroquinolone, it was actually higher than the blood concentration of patients that had received that antibiotic, because once it got into the watercourse, this antibiotic was so stable it was not degraded, and so there were very high levels in the water in the lake. So that's obviously a good haven for resistance to occur in the lake as well. And there've been studies looking at surfers in Cornwall, for example, and they've picked up antibiotic resistant bacteria, not so much from antibiotics being in the seawater, but antibiotic resistant bacteria being in the seawater, because, as you've recently seen, the water companies are discharging overflow into the sea. So we're all being exposed to antibiotic resistant bacteria that way if we go into the water, if we want to go for a swim or surf or whatever. So we're not very good at controlling antibiotics and antibiotic use throughout. And this, we need to take what's called a One Health approach to this problem if we're going to tackle it properly. Now, why is antibiotic resistance so feared, as it were? Well, it's feared because reports have been published that if we don't do anything about antibiotic resistance in the next 20 or 30 years, that by 2050, it's estimated that 10 million people a year will die globally from an antibiotic resistant infection. And that's now 700,000. But that 10 million, look at it, it's more than will die from cancer. That's what the predictions are if we don't do anything about it. I haven't got time to cover in my talk about antibiotic drug development, but there has been no new antibiotic developed, no new class developed for the last 30 years. So pharmaceutical companies are not going to be our saviors if we're going to try and prevent this number of deaths. And this was published by Lord Jim O'Neill in his review in 2016. And in that review, he says, the scenario where we don't take action is truly frightening. And he talks about the 10 million people dying. He also talks about the hit to the world's economy of 100 trillion US dollars, an absolutely gigantic amount of money. And he says it's hard to understand and comprehend these numbers, but they are the future for many individuals. And he says in his report, this report, which I recommend you read, that it's antibiotic resistant is like a slow car crash, slow motion car crash. It's not like a pandemic with COVID. You either know it, you've got it, or you're not got it. This is slow, and every year it's getting worse and worse. So that's the issue that we're faced with. So thinking about when antibiotics are used, they're used for a whole variety of different purposes. They're used, sadly and incorrectly, for throat infections. They're used for urinary tract infections. They're used during C-sections in childbirth. Dental infections, shouldn't use them for, dentists shouldn't use them, but they do. The tooth should be pulled out if it's infected. Bloodstream infection, chest. I mean, we have a list of about 40 different conditions which are wholly and entirely dependent on antibiotics and antibiotic use. And in fact, it's not known, generally known, that the second most common cause of death in cancer patients is actually infection, not the cancer itself, but infection arising from the cancer. So that is a big issue for us in terms of medicine, because if we don't have effective antibiotics, then we're not going to be able to carry out all the medical procedures that we take for granted. Surgery, for example, wholly reliant on antibiotics working. Treatment of bowel cancer, wholly reliant on antibiotics working. So that's why it's so important that we keep our existing antibiotics working, we find new ones, but most importantly, we try and reduce the rate of antibiotic resistance. So how can we reduce resistance? Well, antibiotics should be regarded as the last line of defense and not the first. So people shouldn't be going to their GP and say, Doc, I've got this cough or cold, or my child's got this cough or cold. Please, can you prescribe antibiotics? No, they should not be prescribed antibiotics, and the doctor shouldn't give them. But we've heard of instances where the doctor has been physically harassed by a patient because he wouldn't prescribe antibiotics. And the doctor's only got 10 minutes to see the patient anyway, so it's maybe easier to write a prescription than and get rid of the patient, as it were, rather than have a battle with the patient about why they shouldn't have antibiotics. So most common infections, it says, will get better by themselves. And that's true. I mean, most people don't know that if you get a chest infection, the natural etiology of a chest infection is that it takes about 3 weeks for it to be cured. 3 weeks. So it's no good going to the doctor after 1 week. So I've got this cough, doc. Can you give me some antibiotics because it's not going away? Well, it won't go away because it takes 3 weeks for it to go away. So we need to understand infection better. Antibiotics should only be prescribed by a doctor and should only be taken from a doctor's prescription. You must finish the course of antibiotics, because if you don't finish the course, you're more likely to allow a resistance to occur, because the bugs continue to grow when in fact they should have been killed. And you need to reduce transmission. I'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, don't use other people's leftover antibiotics, because that's just not correct use of these very valuable drugs. These are magic bullets, and we should regard them as really gold dust. I produced this slide long before COVID, but it applies as equally to COVID as it does to bacterial transmission. So you can transmit probably bacteria more easily from surfaces than you can the COVID virus, because actually the COVID virus, believe it or not, is a very weak and puny thing, whereas bacteria are actually quite robust and can hang around for hundreds of years in some cases. So if somebody's got a bacterial, a resistant infection, and they don't wash their hands, for example, they'll contaminate door handles, money, telephones, remote control, shopping trolleys, computer keyboards, etc., etc. And so we need to, just have proper hygiene to avoid that happening. I mean, when's the last time you maybe wiped your computer keyboard with an antibacterial wipe? I certainly don't do it very routinely. And a mobile phone, for example, has 18 times more bacteria on it than a public toilet. I mean, astronomical number. So we need to be careful in terms of bacterial transmission, and obviously hand washing is the best way to avoid transmission. So just as with COVID, sing happy birthday twice, whilst you wash your hands. The same needs to apply when you've been to the toilet to avoid transmission of resistant bacteria. So I think everybody now is familiar with this. And interestingly, because of COVID, the incidence of resistant bacteria transmission has dropped because everybody's being much more careful with washing their hands. And you don't see the same frequency of resistant bacterial transmission as you did before COVID. Whether it'll all go back again once COVID sort of disappears, who knows? So when we're thinking about antibiotics, it says here we need to keep our antibiotics working. We need to keep our current armamentarium of antibiotics working, and we shouldn't use them unnecessarily because 3 million surgical operations are dependent on them every year. That's why it's so important. So what are the drivers of resistance? Well, the two key drivers really are the overuse and the misuse of antibiotics. So the more we demand antibiotics, the greater the exposure of non-resistant bacteria to antibiotics, as a result of which they get mutated and become resistant. And for misuse, it means that we are using them unnecessarily. As I said, coughs, colds, and the like, earache, do not use antibiotics. They are not necessary. Most children, most adults will get better without the use of antibiotics. In fact, there have been lots of studies to show that giving antibiotics, if you have a cough, cold, or an earache, makes zero difference to the length of time it takes to get better. So antibiotics should not be used unnecessarily. Some years back, and we've just done the same exercise actually in the last month or so, but some years back we did an interesting exercise where we looked at prescribing in the community per head of population, and we looked across the whole of England and Wales, but I thought it'd be interesting just to look what's happening in Yorkshire as we're giving our talk in Yorkshire. By the way, I live in York, by the way, so not too far from Leeds. And I'm pleased to see that York actually had a relatively low numbers of prescriptions per head of population compared to Wakefield had the highest, not surprisingly, Scarborough the second highest, and so on. So you can see that there's a gradation. So what's this, 0.48, and this is 0.72. It's nearly 30 or 40% higher prescribing per head. Now that might be partly to do with demography, but I suspect it's also partly to do with GP prescribing habits. The other interesting thing we did was do a heat map, and we looked at the prescribing per capita in August of 2014, and we looked at it in December of the same year. And I think you can see that there was a massive increase in prescribing in the winter months compared to the summer months. Much more prescribing of antibiotics than could be accounted for by the increase in coughs and colds. This is almost like a 40% increase, I think. And in general, in winter, there's about a 10% increase in coughs and colds. So massively overprescribed in the winter months. Again, probably because patients are asking their doctors for antibiotics, perhaps because they want quite naturally to get back to work because they need to earn some money. But the antibiotics that they're prescribed actually won't help them in a great deal, and they will still be very infectious. So when they do go back to work, they'll manage to infect everyone else with their bacterial infection. So that's some background to the problem of antibiotic resistance. It's a global problem. UK, it's a national problem. It's a local problem. In 2019, 96,000 patients were admitted to hospital with an antibiotic resistant infection in England. In the same year, 1.5 million people had a urinary tract infection that needed antibiotic treatment from their GP. So antibiotic resistance is here and it's getting worse. So several years ago, myself and some colleagues were quite concerned about the fact there was not enough coverage, both from a research point of view and also just general knowledge about this problem. So we decided that we would set up a small charity called Antibiotic Research UK. And the charity was founded in 2014. We are a virtual charity. So interestingly, when COVID happened, we were all working from home anyway, so it didn't make any difference to us. We've done quite well since we were formed in 2014. We've raised over £2 million. And I'll talk a little bit about how we spent some of that money. This lady here, some of you might recognize, is Dame Sally Davis, who was one of the proponents of AMR in terms of not enough was being done about it. And she's now our UK AMR envoy, as she's called. But she was the person, the medical officer, the witty person of her time. So she was very instrumental in raising the profile of AMR. And our charity wants to see a world free from drug-resistant infections. So what have we been able to achieve so far? Now, I'm going to do something, and I hope this is going to work. This is a YouTube video, so please bear with me, but it should work if I click on this link.
My name is Mary. I live on the east coast of Scotland. I'm married with 2 grown-up boys. I've just recently become a granny, which we're absolutely thrilled about, and I'm really trying and wanting to be well, to be a good, fit, fun granny. So I've been suffering with a urinary tract infection for 30 years since the birth of my second son. And it has gone from occasional infections, maybe once or twice a year, to 3 or 4 times a year, to a chronic condition that I find myself with now, whereby I can't come off the antibiotics, not even for 36 hours. And if I do come off the antibiotics for any reason, I become very ill very quickly. And obviously the antibiotics have massive side effects, particularly when you take them constantly. Living with an antibiotic resistant infection affects my life in various ways, but probably the biggest thing is that I live in fear all the time. You just never know when this thing will strike, and it comes day, night, anytime, and for me it arrives in a very violent fashion. I'm very quickly very ill, and any plans you've got are cancelled. What scares me most is about antibiotic resistance is the antibiotics not working. I fear one day I might have to have my bladder removed. I fear that this bug might actually get me in the end. It's really, really hard sometimes to keep your spirits up. There are days when I am barely functioning. And when you have an infection, you feel like your life is shrinking away from you. And there are days when you feel that your life is just not worth living, or a life like that is not worth living. And it materially affects your quality of life, and it materially affects my husband's quality of life. Really, if I'm honest, this situation for me has become desperate. You know, I feel desperate sometimes because I have got so much to live for. I've been blessed in many ways with good health, and I've had a lot of luck in my life. I've met a wonderful man to whom I've been married for 33 years. I've got 2 fabulous children and now a little grandchild. And this is a blight in my life. And there are times when I feel completely desperate about it. And I feel lonely and lost and trying to find an answer on my own. And it's very, very hard. Very hard sometimes. this is vital research that is being done for all of our futures, and it relies on charitable donations. So please contribute. I certainly will be, because it's my future and it may well be yours.
Okay, so Mary is a patient with a resistant infection, a UTI, and partly as a result of people like Mary, our charity decided 2 or 3 years ago that it would offer a patient support service to support people like Mary. And this chart, it's a busy slide, but this chart looks at the number of inquiries, and you can see they've skyrocketed over the last year or so, particularly with COVID. We also on the website have a sort of Ask Antruck section, and one of the most frequent questions we're getting asked at the moment, as you can imagine, is if I'm on antibiotics, can I get a COVID vaccination? And the short answer is yes, you can, but we've been told vaccinators are turning people away who've been on antibiotics. They shouldn't be doing that. This is another of our patient ambassadors, Annabelle. Annabelle was horse riding. She fell off a horse, had multiple fractures. Her bones were sticking out from her skin, obviously with a horse and soil, lots of bacteria in the soil. She picked up an infection. She almost had to have her leg amputated. It took her years and years to recover, and she had a chronic resistant infection. Our patient support service has received lots of different awards, including we're getting more and more money now from the National Lottery for our patient support service. So if anybody has a resistant infection or an infection that they want to talk to people about, then please look at our website and you'll get some more information there. Besides our patient support service, we have offered money to academics for small research grants. And again, we've been able to increase the amount of money that we give. The last round, we gave away £200,000 in small research grants, and that money has been used usually by young career scientists to help further their careers. So this is just an example of the last round. I just wanted to show that we've spread the money around in Montfort, Royal Veterinary College, Oxford, Kingston University, Warwick, Pharmacy, UCL, etc., etc. So these are the successful awardees of our last grant round. We're oversubscribed, sadly, by manyfold, so we don't have enough money to give away to everybody. But we are very pleased that we are able to do this in our small way. And it was one of the reasons our charity was formed in the first place, was to try and encourage UK academics. I'm conscious of the time, but I just want to talk about one program that we're working on, which is one we've done ourselves. We're interested in taking existing drugs and seeing if they can be used as antibiotics. So there may be drugs for heart disease or cancer, or any CNS drugs or whatever, and we're asking the question: do these drugs have any antibiotic activity? And we actually have found some drug combinations which do have antibiotic activity, and we're currently hoping to reach a stage where we can take these drug combinations into the clinic. So although this is a relatively small study, which has cost probably about £400,000 to date, we're able, we hope, to get something new into the clinic to treat antibiotic resistant bacteria. We've also done a trial in China where we wanted to see if we could treat infections with non-antibiotics. So there's quite an interest in non-antibiotic alternatives to treat infection. So we have and published now 3 over-the-counter drugs. Loperamide Imodium is one, turmeric curcumin is another, and berberine is the third. And in combination, these drugs seem to be effective in treating travelers' diarrhea, and that's been published. So we're hoping to expand that study in the coming months and years. We also have an educational aspect to what we do, and just highlight some of the things we do. We work with Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, on a report on it's called Change the Course, and that report asks what individuals can do in this area, and they can do lots of different things: spread the word, talk about this to school children, give us money, lots of different things they can do. Our website views have skyrocketed over the last 12 months because of COVID, perhaps because we've got trusted information on our website. We've now had, I think, over 1 million page views since the site was set up. We've organised talks and workshops, so I suppose this is a talk. We've got over 4,500 Twitter followers. We last year had a Radio 4 appeal, BBC Radio 4 appeal. We raised 57,000. That was given by Dr. Adam Rutherford. So lots of things we're doing on the education front. So we're now, what, 7 years old as a charity, and so we thought it was a good time to look at what we're actually doing and see if we ought to be doing anything differently to what we did when we started. We certainly are doing things differently to when we started, because I think we were very much focused on developing new antibiotics when we started, but that is not our primary focus now. So we went out and did some research. We asked researchers, members of the public, and our supporters about what they thought we ought to be doing. And they came up with a whole list of things. And as a result, we were able to pull together a new 5-year strategy. I suppose our overall vision is to see a world free from deaths caused by drug-resistant infections. And we're going to achieve this by driving forward innovative solutions. We want to improve the lives of patients with drug-resistant infections, and we want to raise awareness about the impact of drug-resistant infections. Many people, when asked about antibiotic resistance, they say, oh yes, I understand what antibiotic resistance is, but I've never taken any antibiotics, so I'm not going to get resistance, am I? Well, yes, you are. Actually, it doesn't really matter if you took them or not. And then they also said, well, my body's not resistant to antibiotics. Well, actually, it's not your body; it's the bacteria. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and our charity, one of our roles is to try and overcome those. So when you think about antibiotic resistance, and you think about it from a societal perspective, what does it mean in practice? Well, for the individual, it could mean a treatment failure. You were given an antibiotic, it didn't work. Maybe you were then given another antibiotic and that didn't work. By the time you've reached the 4th one, that didn't work. Well, you may well actually have pneumonia, and you may have sepsis, and you may well die. So treatment failures is one aspect of this. There are obviously economic losses, because with infection, people don't go to work, it takes up beds in hospitals, etc., etc. Resistant bacteria in our environment, I've already talked about. Getting additional infections, what's called secondary infections. So if people have a COVID infection, they are more likely to pick up a secondary bacterial infection, and that secondary bacterial infection actually can kill them. And then, of course, the antibiotics themselves have adverse events as well. So these are some of the things that can happen from antibiotic use. So in conclusion, what can people do to help? Well, the WHO, as fortuitously, between the 18th and the 24th of November, has a World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. And in that awareness week, they want to raise awareness of antimicrobial resistance, and then as a result, there are many different things that are going on. I mean, for example, we have various fundraising activities going on during that week. We also want to help people become more aware of the problem. So these are some of the catchphrases about how you can help to keep antibiotics working. Don't take other person's antibiotics, use only if prescribed, trust your doctor, wash your hands effectively, and get rid of any contaminated material, tissues, etc. Down the toilet. If any of you have any links with universities and university undergraduates, then please ask them to contact us to get involved in something called the Great University Science Quiz. This year's event is on the 24th of November. It's a virtual event like this, and there's various rounds in the quiz, and people, the winners, get prizes, all sorts of fun things. So if you know of anybody who might be interested in participating, they have to be at undergraduate level, then please get them to contact us. This particular event is sponsored both by Pfizer and the diagnostics company bioMérieux, and also Becton Dickinson, or BD. In the past, we said people should have tea parties, but I think with social distancing, COVID, etc., that's much more difficult. But maybe people can have a cake stall or bake a cake, and they can sell that and raise some money for us. Those are some of the ideas. And finally, we could not do anything without the generosity of our supporters and the public. So we want to, and I want to thank them for all that they do for us. And I want to thank you for your time, for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. I don't think you can hear the applause that's obviously going around, unfortunately. But thanks for, oh, Paul's applauding there, I can see. Thank you very much. That's really excellent, very comprehensive coverage of what your work is and involved. We'll just see if we've got any, haven't seen any comments in the chat, any questions in the chat. Is there anyone with questions? No raised hands. Paul has raised his hand.
I'll let somebody else go first, but
Well, I don't see anyone else.
okay. Well, all I was going to say, you know, if you went to the doctor with some complaints and they wanted to give you antibiotics, but assume that they generally know what's what. I don't want to, you know, as a sort of reliable. So, well, you know, what should you do? Anything other than follow their instructions or check it out?
Well, I think you should raise the question with them about whether they're really necessary, because it's estimated about 20 to 30% of antibiotics prescribed by doctors are unnecessary. So that's quite a high percentage. But you see, doctors, first of all, sometimes they don't listen to what they're told. Sometimes they just haven't got time to have a discussion with the patient. I mean, to me, the easiest thing is to give the patient a leaflet and say, look, this is, you know, read this. The other thing that doctors can do is they can do what's called post-dating of prescriptions. So they can date the prescription 1 week from now, and they say, if you're not any better in a week's time, take this prescription to the pharmacy. When that's been done, only 50% of patients who are given a post-dated prescription will actually go to the pharmacy because they're actually better by then. So that's another good way of a doctor sort of, patient feels happy because they've come out with a piece of paper, right? And I'm happy because they actually haven't been given antibiotics. We've been involved in a study, a pilot study, feasibility study, which says that if a patient presents at a doctor with a cough or cold, and they then refer to their local community pharmacy, and the community pharmacist talks to them, they do a very simple test which can distinguish between a viral and a bacterial infection, and they're sort of consulted, then very few patients going through that process actually get antibiotics. I think in one study, about 125 patients went to the docs and said, I've got an infection and I need antibiotics. The doctor sent them to the pharmacist. 4 actually got antibiotics in the end, 4 out of 120. So that tells me that the numbers of antibiotics prescribed is too many, and it can be driven down quite substantially.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Fred Dowson in the chat. What about work with phages, he's saying?
So it's quite a topical question. So for those who don't know what a phage is a bacterial virus, and they are in the environment all around us, phages. The problem with phages is they tend to be quite specific for the bacteria. So you have to know which phage will attack which bacteria. You have to then scale up the production of the phage to actually treat the patient. And sadly, by which time the patient may well be dead. So at the moment, we haven't got anything that is, if you like, available for treatment, but it's certainly an area of active research. To me, I mean, what COVID has shown is how brilliant vaccines can be. And there are very few vaccines against bacteria. I can think of pneumonia, as one, but not very many. So I think that's an area which will expand dramatically in the next few years. And if we could all be vaccinated against antibiotic resistant bacteria, then to an extent the problem goes away.
Thanks. There's another question from Jane Moon. How big a part of the problem is prescribed antibiotics in animals compared to prescribed ones to humans?
So in terms of antibiotic use, I think I've got the numbers right. 60% of antibiotics are going into animals and 40% into humans in the UK. In the United States, 80% are going into animals and 20% into humans. So to me, that's balmy, right? And we should not be using the same antibiotics in animals which we are using in human medicine. We need to conserve those antibiotics for human health. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. There are certainly campaigns to reduce the use of antibiotics in agriculture, but I think personally we still have some way to go.
Thanks very much. I can't see any other.
Yeah, Colin Woodward has his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
you.
Colin,
Yes,
go ahead.
I can see parallels between this and climate change. Something we've known about for several decades, something we've talked about for at least a decade. And have we got really past the talking stage like climate change is doing? Can you see it? Can you see it getting better by 2050?
Not at the current rate of progress, I would say. I think it's a very good analogy because climate change has multiple inputs to get to where we've got to, which is a pretty dire state. And antibiotic resistance also has multiple inputs, as I mentioned. So you have to be able to steward the use of antibiotics throughout the chain of from manufacture to human use. In terms of what needs to be done, I mean, I think as what's the name said, my brain's going, the Swedish climate change campaigner. Anyway, sorry, Greta Thunberg. That's it, Greta Thunberg. Anyway, she said blah blah blah, right, about climate change talkers, and sadly, I think it's a bit the same with antibiotic resistance as well. Too much talk and not enough action.
Thank you.
Any other points? Colin, is there a role for the manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies in all of this? I'm not sure what it might be, but have they got a responsibility themselves, do you think?
So this is a subject of quite hot debate, right? Because think of it like this. You don't want antibiotics to be used unnecessarily, right? So you want to control the usage. But pharmaceutical companies want to have volume-based sales. The more they sell, the better for them, right? So the result of the control of antibiotic use has been that most pharmaceutical companies have pulled out of this area they'd rather make a new cancer drug or a new Alzheimer's drug or a new heart disease drug or a new diabetes drug, because they can see there's chronic use of those drugs, you know, for the person's lifetime. Antibiotics, it's like a course of 10 days and hopefully the person's better, right? And you don't want to be developing a new antibiotic against an antibiotic resistant bacteria unless you want to treat a person with that antibiotic resistant bacterial infection. So you develop a new antibiotic and you have to leave it on the shelf and never use it. So the result has been that small biotech companies that were in this area, they all went bust. I mean, there's been like 20 of them gone bankrupt in the last 2 or 3 years because there's no market. So governments have sort of started to think about how to address that. And schemes are being set up, what I think they've been called fire extinguisher schemes, right? So everybody has a fire extinguisher, or you pay for the fire brigade because you may have to use it one day, but you hope you never do. So the same applies with antibiotics. Insurance policies are being put in place that reimburse the companies irrespective of whether they sell 1 tablet or 1 million tablets. So that is happening. And there's actually the United Kingdom is the first country in the world that's actually set up a scheme to do this. So well done, the United Kingdom.
It's very interesting. Thanks. Yeah. Any others? I think you've been very comprehensive. Oh, here's Paul again.
Yeah, I just wondered, I mean, to get, you know, system change, I mean, presumably there are campaigns. I don't know if the Science and Technology Select Committee has looked at this sort of thing, you know? I mean,
Well,
the trouble is the governments don't always take
well,
notice.
so in the last life sciences report from the government, antibiotic resistance got the grand total of 30 words devoted to it, and when the report had probably around 40,000 words, right? So that tells me that it's not very high up the agenda of the government. There is an all-party parliamentary group on antibiotics, which is pretty defunct, I would say. So, I mean, obviously that's one of the roles of us as a charity, and we're trying to encourage others as well to do more political lobbying. And one of the things that people said to me is, you know, MPs, their mailbags are not overwhelmed with letters about antibiotic resistance. In fact, when I asked my local MP whether he'd ever got any, he said, well, I've had 1 or 2. Well, the mailbag of an MP determines what he thinks about any particular policy, right? So if you want to do something concrete, besides joining our charity, of course, or donating, then write to your MP and ask him what his view is on antibiotic resistance and what he's doing about it in the House, because that, I think, would help to make the situation better.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Any other points, anyone? Otherwise, we'll thank you once again, Colin.
Well, thank everyone for listening. And if you want to know more about the charity, then just look at our website. You can see all the things that we're getting up to. So thanks for your time.
Great,
and
thanks.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for you. Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
very much.
All right.
Very good.
And, so our next meeting will be on the 13th of December.
Yep.
And we're not quite sure whether it will be live or not. Let's hope it's live, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, but just stay tuned to the email list, and hopefully we can do it. But it looks another very interesting talk. I mean, very appreciative of our speakers that give their time for this. So until the 13th of December, or until we communicate one way or another, then all the best to everybody. Keep
Bye-bye.
safe.